All right. Hello, everyone. Happy Monday evening. Welcome to tonight's event. My name is Jenny Marchesota. I'm one of the co-owners at Mysterious Galaxy. I am here to introduce you to our wonderful authors. For those of you who have joined us before for our Crowdcast events, welcome back. For those of you who are new, I will give you the kind of 2-cent tour, give us our wonderful introduction to the authors, and then make my exit temporarily and kind of turn the show over because you're not here to see me. But Crowdcast, on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see the chat section, the comments section. That is where you can share any love for our authors or excitement or commentary, anything like that. Please feel free to join in. Below our images, in that green button, is where you can see the button that says books and book plates. That is where you can go to purchase copies of our wonderful authors' books and purchase a copy of Stormland, and you will get a book plate signed by John Shirley, which is pretty great. Signing books is a little bit different in the COVID age, so, you know, our authors have been gracious enough to offer this, and we thank them profusely. Below the book plates button, you can see the Ask a Question button. That is where you can share any questions you have for our authors. Later in the event, we will kind of open it up to audience questions, and that's where we will be pulling the questions from. Once those questions are there, you can also upvote them. So if somebody asked a question that you were going to ask, but you really want to make sure it's answered, you can just hit like that question, or you vote for it, and it moves it to the top of the list, so it makes sure that we cover it. Okay, now for tonight's main attraction. Tonight we have John Shirley celebrating his book Stormland, and John Shirley is one of the original cyberpunk writers. He is the author of numerous novels, including Demons, Crawlers, Wetbones, CELLARS, Bleak History, City Come A-Walkin, BIOSHOck, Rapture, and the Song Called Youth trilogy. His story collections include the Bram Stoker Award-winning Black Butterflies, and he is the co-screenwriter of The Crow, has written an episode of the Star Trek Deep Space Nine television series, as well as some animation scripts. Joining him tonight is Greg Bear. He has written more than 30 novels and 5 story collections, including The Unfinished Land, his most recent book, and they have earned him 5 Nebulas, 2 Hugos, 2 Endeavors, and the Galaxy Award. He is one of the original founders of San Diego Comic-Con, which many of us are familiar with, I'm sure. So on that note, I am going to turn it over, and I will be seeing you again once we get to those audience questions. But John and Greg, please take it away.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's get my book over with so we can talk about yours, because I'm really excited to hear you explain that. Stormland is a near futures climate fiction cyberpunk detective novel amalgam. It's a fusion, and it's set in the mid 21st century, a little past. And one of the most basic premises, are the fact that there's a storm that is pretty much perpetual in this area that's colloquially called Stormland, and that's centered in Charleston on the southeast coast. And I picked that area because I did some research, and it looks like it's going to be in the path of a lot of really troublesome weather in the mid and late 21st century. But the whole concept of an area where storms are more or less perpetual, one geographical area, 500 square miles, can I justify it? Well, sometimes I reach for example, the big red spot on the planet Jupiter, which is a perpetual storm. But in the book, I explain a variety of causes having to do with warming the warming seas, jet streams, the movement of jet streams and their changing movements under the pressure of climate change, and other factors of this kind that make it probable that some areas anyway will have a lot of storms, more than we can even imagine right now. And I made this one more or less perpetual, partly because it's a great metaphor for what the world will be struggling with in the future, especially when we consider the few people who remain in the area and what their lives are like. And partly because it's just a fantastic world to imagine oneself in. I mean, it seems like a gigantic negative, and it is, but it's also something that in constantly struggling with. All these powerful human energies come into relief, and so there's a lot of great story there that is generated by the a place where hurricane after hurricane after hurricane comes in over and over again, day after day, for year after year. I think most people are aware that climate change is bringing with it, besides the heat that we're experiencing now, at this moment, under this enormous heat dome here in the West, extreme weather. And it's becoming more and more accepted by more people. There's been some resistance to it, but more and more people are admitting it's going to be the case. So I was looking also for a way to dramatize how we struggle with that in real life in the mid 21st century. And I chose a very extreme example, but I also talk about other parts of the country and what falls out as a result of sudden climate and meteorological changes, and so I'm kind of looking for a big picture that's exemplified by Stormland. And the plot is it's launched. Its springboard is that there's a former U.S. Marshal who's left the U.S. Marshal Service after it became privatized and became very corrupt, and works privately to find people who are missing. And there are a lot of people who go missing in the future in America in these climate change extremes and across the world because of the necessary, sometimes almost spontaneous emigration necessary when it's unexpected floods and other kinds of extreme conditions overtake populations. So a lot of people go missing, and there's a whole kind of industry of searching for these missing people this guy is representative of. He's basically the protagonist. There are other interesting characters, but one person he encounters in his quest to find a supposed serial killer who is hiding in Stormland is a man that the locals know as the kindest man in Stormland. He's a sort of saintly guy who is taking care of people in these terrible conditions. Of course, most people have left the city, but some people are there because they're hiding out. Some people are there because there are ways to scavenge in the city which you can make money from with nobody to stop you. And then there are gangs and so on. And there are ways to move between the storms and to move underground, and so that some life there is possible, but it's very much reduced. It's a population of maybe 5,000 or 6,000 people in the whole city now. But still, somebody has to look after these people. This guy does some of it. There's no real law there, and our hero finds himself trapped in Stormland. He is not. After he finds what he thinks is the serial killer he was looking for, he is unable to leave because of certain plot eventualities, and being trapped there, he decides to try and help out. He partners with this guy who he thinks is the kindest man in Stormland, who actually is a former serial killer himself. But in the future, it's discovered that the majority of psycho killers are actually suffering neurological dysfunction, sometimes as a result of their parents' drug use, alcohol use, fetal alcohol syndrome, other factors that actually change the physical structure of their brain, so that they can't empathize, and they struggle to make connection with anybody, and they become desperate and they begin to kill people in order to accomplish some kind of connection. There's some evidence that this is the case with many of them in real life. So it's been proposed that you can cure them through new technologies, new biotechnologies that I describe in the book, that restore these missing parts of the brain, and these areas of the brain can then be trained so that they can become empathetic. And this guy was allowed to go and live in Stormland as part of an experiment carried out by certain medical institutions. And he's constantly being monitored by a sort of weird little halo of micro drones flying around his head.
Like gnats in a southern thunderstorm.
Yeah, really. Well, all of that is covered. You've got it, and most of the time they're undercover. Everybody, inside a building, hoping the building doesn't collapse. Some of them do. Anyway, that's enough, except to say that there are antagonists in the story. There are villains who are up to something unspeakable that our hero did not anticipate, and probably the readers won't either for quite a while. They think it's about one thing and it's about another, and it expands from there. And it's a thriller. It's designed to be, a futuristic thriller and to be a page turner, and but it's about serious things, and I talk about a lot of near future technologies and how they play out and how they affect people's lives, as well as the radical conditions of the climate in the future. So that's my pitch.
It's a very compelling book. I think that the plot is just part of it. The characters and everything. It's really a TV miniseries. So
there has been some discussion about that, but we'll see how that pans out.
Yeah. Anyway, quite lovely. And I congratulate you on getting it done. It kind of reminds me a bit of Heavy Weather meets Damnation Alley, if we're gonna pitch it by comparison.
If you're gonna, that's the Hollywood pitch, right?
That's right. Anyway, it's a very good book.
So your new novel is just so interesting to me. It's a fantasy novel, and you've taken all these mythologies from Celtic mythologies, and also some things that seem to be more Nordic, more Norse in origin, and sort of, and they seem to all work together into what might be an alternate history. I can't tell exactly, but it's or it could be a secret history of the Earth, set in not ancient times. What century was it exactly?
Well, it's the 16th century. It's basically the
17th or 16th, right?
Yeah, the Spanish and the English. It begins with the I'm getting echoed here off my own voice. So how do I cut that off? Anyway, it's the invasion of England in the 16th century.
Oh, I need to hear you though. Okay.
And that's where it begins. And so we've got a character who is a kid who is sent out with the fleet to help protect the Queen's fleet and ships against the Spanish off Gravesend. And that's where it begins. And he's wrecked. He's on a shipwreck. So this is getting irritating here.
You have
How
an
do we
echo.
cut off the echo?
Do you have any headphones?
No.
That's usually
I could.
like
No,
the
I
other thing that
couldn't either.
sometimes works is if you log out and log back in.
Probably shouldn't have to do that. Let me see if
It's not from you. It's from
No?
me here. So it's we have Astra's our expert on this.
Okay, I think we had 2 windows open,
Okay.
but I guess it's not better yet. I do have some headphones. If you want to try that.
Okay, let's try it. Oh, these are awful. I can't wear these. Okay, let's just power on.
Okay. So you were talking about using an unusual compositional method. That unusual for you. I mean, you're really going directly from your subconscious. And
Well,
what
that's
was that
kind
like?
of how I usually write my novels, is they tell me what's going on. This one was particularly so. Okay, so
I mean, how does that work? How do you evoke that state?
well, as you know, can you hear me?
I hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Good. That seems to have eliminated it. When you're writing a story, you're not really the one in charge. At least I'm not. You have to kind of collaborate with your subconscious, and the subconscious is solving most of the problems behind the scenes. And then occasionally it'll pop up and say, okay, you got to write something now, because we're all done with that and we processed it. And it's kind of like watching a movie in your head, except that you're more than just the audience. You're also talking on the booth with the collaborators of the subconscious writers. In this case, the book really did come out of that early stage of being in the subconscious mind. And so it's telling me, okay, what if history is written the way we write a book? What if the history that you know is created by beings that come from other dimensions and other planets?
Mm-hmm.
And so these creators are not quite human and not quite monster. We don't know what they are. But when you meet them, they're multidimensional. And we don't meet them until toward the end of the book. But along the way, you'll learn this is how history is made, is that these creatures think things through and project them onto the rest of the world. And then they send out sailors to go figure out what's going on and report back. And one of our main characters is a sailor who has been out to the outer world and seen the changes they've made. And he comes back from Japan and the Philippines and all that stuff. But the real masters here, the ones who fed these monsters, these creative monsters, their languages, were the travelers. They're what we would call, in some cases, the gypsies. And it turns out that some gypsies actually accept that name in South India, for example. Others do not. In England, they don't. But the travelers are the ones who gave the world the languages and the things that they use to describe what's going on in history. And that whole process is one of my fun things, is working with books that I've collected over the years on gypsy lore, Tinker's Cant, and all that sort of stuff, which I've always loved. And I've put that in here.
That's right. You have the gypsy element too.
Yeah. And the travelers have their caravans and their trailers, and some of them are pretty strange in themselves.
Yeah. It's just a wonderful idea. There's just so much you can do with that. And what strikes me about it is that it's world building, but in our world.
Yeah.
You've built our world into another world by opening up positing a secret layer somewhere that you can, or an onion peel or something you can peel back and reveal this other level of it that is really behind the kind of evolution of things. I mean, fancifully, I don't think you probably literally believe that, or does he?
We will not tell the truth here, but I had great fun doing it.
But
and,
it's,
you know,
but
I
it,
think
yeah.
I think I began this book back in early 1980s, thinking about it, and finally got around to writing it. And you know, it's really grown in a strange way in my writing. And it turns out that when you turn the subconscious mind backwards upon itself, it gets even more creative.
Now, what you got to explain that, for turning the subconscious mind upon itself. Now, how does that work?
Well, it's like if you acknowledge that these creatures create history, are you acknowledging that your brain helps create history as well? And I think you could say that. I think that we in our creative culture help write history in an interesting way. And when you get around to, you know, the languages that we use and how we describe these things, that's fascinating for me, especially when you get into Tinker's Cant and all that sort of stuff that's not really languages, but a kind of amalgams, creoles, as it were, of real historical peoples traveling. But in this case, I think traveling from South India and up. The one thing that I don't go into too much in this is there are many, our characters end up on an island at the top of the world. Basically, they're on an island that is helping create the northern thing, northern and European history. But there are other islands that are helping create other versions of history. And these islands can be Asian, they can be, you know, combinations of the two. But when you get to these other islands, you're working in another realm, and those creative monsters who help create that history are different from ours. And so when they intersect, as one of our main characters does when he goes to the Philippines and Japan, then you have really interesting results. And it's like the monsters are collaborating with each other. And boy, that sounds like history to me.
It's, you know, well, yes. I mean, when you consider the conquistadors and South America and the first people from Europe really significantly visiting Japan, and the reaction to them in Japan, and these strange interplay there. And you know what? And when you talk about the creative side of culture affecting things, it makes me think of Wittgenstein, and also maybe the languages of Peo, and there was a Delaney book about language that it made, and I forget the title of, but it's kind of that feeling of like, you know, the art and artifice really affecting the history in ways that we don't really see, because we're too much in we're too much in it. We can't see the forest for the trees. We don't see ourselves doing it, you know. So we use language that you know, affects how people are treated. Obviously, prejudicial language would do that, and also our attitudes and how we demonstrate things in a culture. In like movies and so on, can affect life, and also things like, you know, do you remember The Jungle, that novel from the early 20th century? How it is the novel that changed the whole food industry in America.
Right, Upton Sinclair.
And you know, he sort of made it come, the reality of that, the horror of the way that things were done and the irresponsibility in it. He made all that come alive for people through this art format. Films have done it too. You know, books like Uncle Tom's Cabin and so on, and also when, you know, when you hear a sort of semi-mythical stories in one country in ancient times, and they hear of these fanciful stories of wonderful things in the East, so this inspired people like Marco Polo, and which led to other things.
I love Marco Polo, and you know, he kind of proved himself to me when he described this. He was traveling across the desert. He says, "You know what they use oil for?" He says they take these seeds and they spread them on the skin sores of camels to help heal them. Oh. And I'm going, oh my God, that's like coal tar dye today. You know, they use that to help heal skin for us. So where did they discover that? Well, that seems to be a pretty authentic element to me.
Yeah.
A lot of contemporary scholars are not that fond of Marco Polo, but I am.
There are people who have tried to claim that he never went, or barely. Right. But actually, I was reading about this recently, and the preponderance of scholars think that he did, and that he did what he said he did.
Yeah, makes sense to me. Also, I read a lot of Filipino history from the Spanish conquest, the Spanish records of the Philippines back in the 16th century. As a kid, I lived in the Philippines as a Navy brat and got to go to different parts of the islands and see the war damage from World War II and all that sort of stuff, and meet a lot of the Filipinos as a 7-year-old. And that really influenced me. But then going back to their history and realizing there was a time when the Catholic priests protected the Filipinos against the military culture that was trying to dominate it at that time. I go, oh my gosh, that's a new avenue, a new wrinkle, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it kind of echoes The Mission, the movie The Mission, which is a very interesting film.
Right. That's based on a true story, isn't it?
Yeah.
About
so that was kind of part of the influence of what's going on between one of my characters here, who shepherds our little kid, Renard, through some of the avenues of this world that he's a part of, actually. He comes from this island at the top of the world and goes out on missions to bring back the history to the gods that help make it, the godlike beings. And eventually we meet them and we realize these are more like H.P. Lovecraft than like our creative influences. You know, these are multidimensional beings who come from another dimension and came to Earth, but they came without language. And when they came to Earth, they were dumb. They could not speak. And so what happened was the travelers arrived and started teaching them how to speak and to use language. And that's when history began. And I find that to be a really interesting concept, is without language, you don't have history.
Well, that's true. You would just have the history of one tribe assaulting another and never being able to talk about it.
Only what they can remember, too.
Just destruction, really, probably.
Right.
Without language, I'm not sure the race would have survived very long. There would be too much warring and this, competition. Without any, people wouldn't be able to trade and so on.
Right.
We might not have survived as a species.
Right. So the other part is that one of the things we learn in philosophy classes is that one of the aspects of language is mathematics. Mathematics is in fact language. It's just a certain kind of language, enumerating and precise. There are two different kinds of beings in our culture. One of which is word nerds, and the other is math nerds. And I'm more of a word nerd, but I certainly respect math nerds.
Yeah.
And, I've watched a lot of them take over the world here in Seattle. And that's fascinated me. But the whole notion of the development of the mathematical language, which we get at the end of my book, fascinates me. And you eventually end up passing along certain inputs and certain functions to major people in our history. And there's a character, a sort of a character, but also maybe just a figure, the man with the white shadow. And I have no idea who or what he is, but he runs into Reynard and he kind of controls Reynard's life. He's going to use Reynard to deliver these historical impulses to some key historical figures that the readers will recognize. And so I think that's great fun.
And here's a character that you don't really understand yourself, but it's a very important character. And that just goes to show how some of this sprang from your subconscious.
Yep. And I have no idea what the character with the white shadow is.
I love the idea of the man with the white shadow. I love the sound of that and the image that it evokes. And this thing about mathematics, there have been even some preliminary attempts to communicate with aliens, putative extraterrestrials, through mathematics. Because when they sent out the probe that went beyond the edge of the solar system there were some math attempts to reproduce some sort of mathematical imagery that they might be able to comprehend to try and say something to them.
Right.
And it's something, and some scientists have speculated that might be the first way that we can communicate with them.
Yeah, and I kind of wonder what would happen had they sent on the Voyager mission a plaque that had a bit from Finnegan's Wake in it. You know? That might have been an interesting, because I love Finnegan's Wake, but of course it's not very mathematical.
Well, they should know those side. I'm glad that they also had some Chuck Berry.
They did.
And Little Richard.
Now you're being a
very
profound musician, a composer. Is music related to math, or is it related to emotions, or both?
Oh, well, it's a big question. I'm probably not mathematician enough to really know, but math certainly comes into music all the time. The majority, I mean, maybe not John Cage, but more orderly forms of music are measured. They're in measures, right? And that's mathematical. And it's in time, and beats in time, are measured, and are, there's so many, and that's counting. And then it's all these other layers too that have relationships that could have mathematical implications. I'm sure, like you layer the bass on the guitar, or the various symphonic parts of an orchestra. I'm sure there's a lot. It's for some people. If you think about Bach, it's as if it's very beautiful. But it's as if it's math first, and then emotion is written in the math of Bach, in a sense, to me. So, and then in other kinds of music, Penderecki or Stravinsky sometimes, or rock and roll, my little bailiwick. It's the emotion is probably usually the most powerful element. There's some pretty austere rock and roll around, and then we have things like Kraftwerk and bands like that, but electronic music. But it's it's like trying to find a 20th century car that doesn't run on gasoline. It's like trying to find rock and roll without emotion. It's got to have something burning at the center of it to drive it.
Absolutely. Frank Zappa's favorite composers, I'm not going to remember who they were right now, but they were pretty amazing. Have you looked into that? Zappa?
Stravinsky, Varese, he liked.
Yeah, Varese, that's it.
For example. Yeah.
And that struck me as a very, in fact, I used that when I was teaching an art class and impressed a bunch of kids. Says, who's Frank Zappa's favorite composer? And they shook their heads. And I says, I don't know. Grateful Dead? And I says, no, it was Varese. No. So that kind of shook them. They didn't know who Varese was, so I had to play some of it for them.
Yeah. That kind of thing. He was a syncretist. And he would have all these very basic, musical structures, and then suddenly he would sort of seduce you in with that, and then take you off into another world, which is kind of like in science fiction, where we ground things in the real world.
Yep.
And then we introduce the bizarrity or some fantastic change or something. It's very related, and he loves science fiction writers. He listed several of them on his first album as being influences. I remember Robert Sheckley was one. Yeah,
Sheckley was pretty well regarded. When we were putting together the Science Fiction Museum up here in Seattle for Paul Allen, the original EMP had started off as a kind of a temple to Jimi Hendrix. So when we were putting this all together, we took a picture of Hendrix before he was going on stage, and he's sitting there reading a paperback, and you realize the paperback is Philip was a farmer.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
And he loved to read between sets. He loved to read science fiction. We knew a lot of rock musicians who were fans of science fiction and fantasy.
there are references to spacecraft and extraterrestrials in some of his songs.
Yeah.
And at least one album that he was working on when he died was released later, posthumously, is about visiting alien worlds, oceanic worlds, and going into the ocean of an alien world, and as he imagined it. So yeah, Jimi Hendrix loved that stuff, and he always made me feel good. You know, like he would understand me.
Yeah.
You know?
I love Hendrix, but also, you know, there's so many other rock musicians, including yourself, who have mastery of both music and language. And, you know, the history of rock music would be a little different if it wasn't for science fiction and fantasy.
Oh, I think that's true. I think a lot of people have been influenced by it and drawn it. David Bowie comes immediately to mind. You know, he referenced a lot of science fiction and science imagery but many others, Pink Floyd, you know, people like that. There's so many, and there, in fact, there's a whole subgenre of space rock, you know. So that is a thing in itself. But I do some of that. I have two kind of branches to my current musical effort. One, I work with Jerry King, who is a prog rock guy. And we did an album called Spaceship Landing in a Cemetery.
Oh.
And it did pretty well. It got a good review in Prog magazine. It's the basic slick magazine about progressive rock. And then the other thing is post-punk kind of, well, Stooges influence, Iggy and the Stooges influence, Rolling Stones influenced, the Animals, but, you know, for our time. And it's a band called the Screaming Geezers.
Uh-huh.
Are we not supposed to give websites addresses? I'm going to say screaminggeezers.com.
That'll work.
All right. There's samples there. But but both things have in common. There's a lot of emotional value in it. But Jerry King is this great prog guitar player and composer. His stuff is very it's like on another plane. It's almost abstract, and yet then I bring this kind of visceral element to it, to this abstract world. And so that's the kind of collaboration we're doing. We have a new album coming out pretty soon.
Very cool.
And I write lyrics for the Blue Oyster Cult, and so I want to plug their new album, their first studio album in 20 years, which has science fiction elements in it, as I will tell you, but it's called The Symbol Remains, this album. It's their first studio album in 20 years, and it is really good, and it's actually already a success. It did really well charted in Billboard, and they're even sending me royalties and for my
Oh, cool.
I wrote the lyrics for 5 of the songs, including
very good, yeah,
2 singles. But like one of the songs, you mentioned Lovecraft, one of the songs, which I did not write the lyrics for, it's called The Alchemist, is inspired by an early short story of H.P. Lovecraft. And it even quotes from the story. And it's this just really this beautiful confection of a hard rock song about this alchemist who's carrying out his sort of esoteric vendetta against this family because of what they did to him. And it's just a great little set piece. It's just a wonderful little world to visit. It's a good video too, The Alchemist from the new Blue Oyster Cult album. So there you have, and that band always had songs like The Subhuman, that was about creatures, like humanoid creatures living in the sea, a different kind of humanoid creature, not merman, but something else. They had that. They've always had songs about supernatural beings, and also extraterrestrial visitation was a big thing in the Blue Oyster Cult albums. So they're just another example of where science fiction and rock came together very comfortably, and the mutual inspiration.
So who did the album The White Ship?
The
Like
white
in the 60s, yeah.
the white ship. Who was that? Somebody, perhaps one of our
Go to the great group mind out there, and they can figure it
the
out.
group mind will tell us who did the white ship. Is it time to do that now? I think we should probably.
Let's go get some questions.
Dan Sauer says the band called H.P. Lovecraft.
Oh, there you go.
That would make
Why
sense.
not? Yeah.
So let's have some questions if there are any. Please have some questions.
All right, I'm back. Hello. Okay, yeah, so we are going to move to questions. Please, everyone in the audience, if you have any questions or you want to keep adding them, go hit that ask a question button and drop them in there. We've got a couple waiting, but we could always use more. And the first one is from Todd. And regarding Stormland, what can be shared regarding a potential miniseries? You dropped the hint, and
I did. Well, I can't share anything because it's still being discussed. It's one of those things that there's a major producer, a major television producer and movie producer who would like to bring it out, and right now he's searching for a showrunner so that then he and the showrunner, who's got to be somebody with credits, can pitch it to the studios. And so we'll see if that pans out. That's all I can say. But there is interest in the Stormland in that way. I do think it is a kind of a mini series generating story. I would naturally think so, though. But yeah, anything else? How about for Greg? Got anything?
Far too many things. There's been stuff going on since at least 1992. Unfortunately, we lost one of our great screenwriters just recently. He did a great screenplay of Blood Music, Louis John Carlino, and his daughter has picked it up and is running with it now. But also, we've got other interest in possibly in Blood Music, and it's a real mishmash. Forge of God was over at Warner Brothers for 5 years, and boy, it made a bunch of money for us. And but it never got. Pardon?
Made a bunch of money for you without being produced.
Without being produced, right? That's
this happened to me too. My novel Demons, I was paid very well for the option. The Dimension Pictures had it, and then the recession came, and they dropped all these projects. They had a director, they had a script, but they dropped everything but like their definite money makers that they already had. The name association for. So Demons didn't get made based on my novel, but there's some more interest in that. But this is the time, it seems to me, for Blood Music, because I think technology has kind of nanotechnology and microbiology, and it may be a time when it seems scarily relevant.
Yeah, we'll see. But there have been so many versions of different stories of mine that they tried to make into films that I really don't know when it will ever get done. You've had movies made, so name some of your other films besides The Crow, which is pretty good.
Well, I don't like the others, so never mind. But I want to be associated with. I found the comic book of The Crow was in a cutout bin, and it was this black and white comic, and I said, this is so cinematic, and I took it to this friend of mine who was a nascent producer, and we found the comic artist, and we used the comic book sort of as a storyboard like they have for films. Sure. When we pitched it to Edward R. Pressman, and so he went for it, and then they took it to Paramount eventually, and then I wrote the first 4 drafts, and then Dave Scow, he did this great series of drafts, and it's a bittersweet memory, that movie, because Brandon Lee was killed because of the incompetence of certain people who handle firearms on the set. They were not careful enough and didn't check the barrel to see this. Otherwise, they would have seen an obstruction in the barrel of that gun. So that's something that I never can forget when the subject of The Crow comes up, that he lost his life. But I think it's a good movie, and then I worked in various TV shows and Deep Space Nine and Poltergeist: The Legacy. Mostly the others were cable things. I did a couple of things for Paramount Television and that were made, and they were okay. I'm not that enthusiastic about any of that history, but and I wrote a bunch of basically Saturday morning cartoons and some primetime cartoon animation stuff. I even got an Emmy nomination for a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles I wrote in the CGI version for primetime animation, but we lost to Bob's Burgers.
Oh.
I'm sure Bob's Burgers was more
category.
deserving. I do think it probably was more deserving. I didn't see it. It probably was. But, yeah, I like working in animation. I'd love to write an animated film, a full film. I'm hoping I have daydreamed about a sort of adult animated thing to be made of my novel Demons, maybe.
All right. Well, thank you. The next question is from Dave. For both Greg and John, since we're talking rock and roll and sci-fi, if one of your works, it jumped around. If one of your works is adapted, what song would you love to see be part of the soundtrack and why?
A song that already exists? I've got a lot of favorites.
I think it's up to you.
Well, there's a fellow named
what
David.
Song would you want to?
That's what like Hendrix or what?
Yeah, there's a fellow named David Tyree who's actually working on an opera version of the Infinity Concerto called Song of the She-Dark. And I'm looking forward to seeing it. It's like 3 hours long right now, and he's working on it. But that'll be fascinating. And of course, all the songs will be his. And so I've never had an opera written before, but this is a possibility.
Well, I'd like some Blue Oyster Cult songs in my movie adaptation, and not necessarily just the ones I write. It would depend on what was adapted. I mean, some things, if it was like some certain Zappa things would be good. If it was really very cyberpunk, dark street stuff, that suggests some of the great prog rock people out there, King Crimson, for example.
Lots of possibilities.
Yeah. All right. The next question comes from one of our booksellers, Rob, and he asked, John, what came to surpass that surprised you the most from your own cyberpunk novels, and what elements of cyberpunk came to pass that you never would have predicted?
Well, there's a lot in that. I predicted this new form of video where you can't tell it from a reality. That's coming out now, and it's coming into common usage, and it's very scary. Deep fake, it's called, and it's it can be used to influence history. As you could falsify that our nation is being invaded. Here's a clear-cut image of the tanks rolling across. Mexico is invading us. Mexican tanks we've got to bomb Mexico. And they could make it look totally real, and it would not exist at all. Or just somebody, they want to bring down some, a national leader. They could fabricate images of him doing something terrible in a back room somewhere. So it's a very dangerous thing, and I did predict it in my Eclipse novels. The song called Youth Books, which have been re-released by Dover. There was, I also, in City Come A-Walkin, I predicted electronic money transfers of the kind that we have now, and PayPal type things. I even predicted ATMs. They didn't exist then. And I could go, there's a bunch of things, also sociological events that kind of came out. but I don't want to go. I can go off on that too long. I have noticed, it bothers me that there are, for example, we didn't envision QAnon, but QAnon is a really weird kind of. It has a cyberpunk element in that it's internet fueled and based. And it's amazing. Supposedly 30 million Americans take it seriously, and it's just other falsehoods. But they're really very serious about it. It has led to some violence in some places, and will probably lead to more violence. And so we didn't predict that I know of. Maybe somebody will think of some science fiction or cyberpunk writer. Maybe the Marching Morons going way back.
Yeah, yeah.
But so, what about you, Greg?
I'm not sure I predict much. There's been some interesting things. Certainly this viral element. If you think of the viruses leading to mutation, that's kind of what's happening to our society now, but we've had it before. So I'm not going to claim credit for predicting anything because I think it's too troublesome. Could get us in real difficulties if we take credit for something that stupid or that awful.
Yeah, okay.
Fair enough. For both of you, what scene in either Stormland or The Unfinished Land gave you the most joy to write?
What do you think, Greg?
I think the revelation that the history is created by Lovecraftian monsters was a fabulous thing to write. And then to extend it and say, okay, you're going to take the influences of these monsters and extend it out to the rest of the Western world and get the real modern Western world created on the next stage. And that I loved writing about it. Putting in the little clues as to who we're talking about here. Francis Bacon and all those sorts of people. That was great fun to do. But also to help create the side historical monsters and characters and fantasy figures, such as Calibo, who is not a vampire of blood, but a vampire of time. And all of his people.
That's right,
Yeah.
that whole vampirizing time thing. Would you explain that a little bit for people?
Well,
I
these
really
vampires,
that's a great concept.
These vampires are dark, shadowy figures that if they approach you, they can take away all the life you have left and leave if you're a 10-year-old boy on a Spanish galleon, for example, suddenly they leave this very thin 40-year-old and they take that 30 years and they run with it for their own use. And sometimes they could pass it on to other people. And so you can have the vampires giving time, which is what they do for Reynard, is he's off to find out what's going on with the history in the world. They stock him up with time.
So they imbibe time like the actual events of your life, in a sense, like the events rather than your blood or something.
No, they take the actual time that you've got,
yes,
and run with it, and it kind of scrub it clean. It's free of any association with you thereafter. So that was an interesting concept, and I'm pretty sure it's not original, but I don't know of any other instances of it.
No, you could do a lot with that. Yeah. The scene in Stormland. I have a sort of subculture there in this one particular little colony of squatters. The squatter culture in Stormland, the whole town is squatter culture. And that's something that I was influenced by when I traveled in Europe in the 80s. And there were little community squatter cultures around in Italy and Holland, for example, and people were often allowed by the public, by the government, to take over buildings that were not being used for other things, and they created these little villages inside these large buildings. And so I looked at how they did that, and some of that's happened, was kind of seeped over into New York City too. So this subculture is like that. It's kind of this weird little squatter culture, but this particular one happens to be based on worship of a deity who's based on the Egyptian god Set, god of various things, but war and weather are involved, and so they worship this deity Set, and there's a scene where they have the shape, the whorl shape of a hurricane seen from above. It's kind of a spiral, almost like a galactic spiral of a hurricane. They have this drilled into the wall with little holes, and then the wind from a hurricane blows through these little holes. and then there's an effect that kind of where they sort of see this, get a sense of this god that is the god of the storms, that this one particular cult leader, who's actually a sort of benevolent cult leader, not really an evil one. He's just kind of like trying to get them through by letting them, exorcise their fears this way. He has a big rally with everybody at one of these gatherings to worship this god of storms, and I just think it's just a very vivid scene. So kind of exploration into people's need to believe in something bigger than themselves, and realized visually. So I kind of dug that, I think.
Very cool.
Right.
I've got time for one more question before I start to fade out. So what you got?
Yeah, we got one more, and that is for both of you. What's next? What are you working on? Let's see. Gregory asked, Greg, are you continuing to explore this technique of letting the story content, so to speak, guide you? And Jay asked earlier, just said how happy they are for how prolific John Shirley has become, and just wants to know what else you're working on.
Well, I just finished writing my memoirs, so I hope to find a publisher for that soon. And it's kind of my history in publishing, starting out when I was a kid. So the early stages are, back before we did Comic-Con and all that stuff. And the later stages are working with so many editors and writers and becoming part of the science fiction world. And John Shirley's world, too. I think one of his great titles is City Come A-Walking. That's one of my favorites.
What am I doing next? I'm City Come A-Walkin' is coming out in a new limited edition from Centipede Books, by the way. What I'm doing is I'm writing a novel of the gold fields in the 19th century Nevada, and some of it is in the nature of a Western. It's called Axle Bust Creek. The town is called Axle Bust. And there's a creek called Axle Bust because somebody trying to get their wagon through busted their axle there. There's a lot of intrigue that goes on in the town, but one of the points of interest is that I was studying women scientists, real life women scientists, in the 19th century. And they were there, and of course they were overlooked mostly. In fact, going back centuries, there were women scientists who were overlooked mostly. And so I decided to create a fictional one. She's also, of course, a suffragette and a women's rights person, and those people were around in the 19th century also. So our hero is an ex-Union officer who's involved in various intrigues, but he falls in love with this woman. And she, there's some people who are dying in a mine, and her scientific knowledge of geology and hydraulics and hydrology enable her to suggest something that saves everyone from drowning in the mine. And just as an example of the way we use her, but also she's just a wonderful character, a woman scientist in the 19th century in Axle Bust Creek. Yeah,
that's very cool.
Pinnacle's doing it, and it's about half written, and I'd like to write a sequel to Stormland because it was in this. I want to talk about that world a lot more. It's all kinds of things I had to cut because it just had to keep the pacing, but I'd like to get back into it again if it were possible.
Very cool. I'm also for Mysterious Galaxy. This is a possibility. I'm actually beginning a mystery novel set in La Jolla. And, you know, I know La Jolla pretty well, although I'm up here in the Northwest now. I was a kid that worked in La Jolla for years. And I'm having fun with that, but I don't know if I'll ever finish it. I got to learn the entire genre. And that's by reading everybody who's written. I've already read a lot of it, but, you know, got to catch up on it.
Oh, it is.
There's always more to read.
I've
Yeah.
fantasized about writing a mystery too, and I've written my novel, The Brigade, was kind of a mystery. It was more of a thriller, but that came out years ago, and it's still around. But I never wrote a real mystery. I always wanted to conquer that method, you know,
That's
the technique, you know. And Jack Vance was a science fiction writer who did a good job.
He did a really good job. Paul Anderson wrote some mysteries set in the Bay Area too, so those are kind of classic, and we're getting those reprinted.
So, and Stormland is kind of like my little bridge to it, because there's a detective at this heart of it, and so I'm sort of practicing mysteries while writing.
Which we often do, don't we? I think
That's
true.
true.
Writing Quantico and so on, these were kind of suspense mysteries.
That's right. That's true.
FYI novels.
We steal from them all the time.
That's right.
And espionage novels too. Most of the cyberpunk writers borrowed heavily from John le Carre and Lynn
Oh,
Davis
yeah.
and people like that, and just the kind of the way the story is put together. And so, you know, we're influenced by the better element of these other genres.
Very cool.
Very cool.
Well, it's been delightful to sit around and chat with you guys. And John, it's good to see you again and live rather than just being on the cyberpunk group, which is always fun.
No, this is just an AI representation I created that.
Well, that really realistic video.
I'm actually
right?
having dinner right now. I made an expert system, and it says what I would say basically, including the stammers and everything.
It's pretty convincing. I like it.
Yeah, I use deep fake video for it.
All right, I was going to say. Well, thank you both for joining us so much. This has been a great event. It was a great conversation. You guys are obviously very comfortable with each other, and that always makes for wonderful conversation.
We should do it live sometime too.
Yeah.
Yes. Hopefully, you know, in the not too distant future. It's taken our cues from publishers as well as some authors at this point, but
absolutely,
they are the rumblings are happening again for
cool. Looking forward to it.
So that's great.
I've had my shots. Greg,
I've had my shot. I'm arrogant and
shot.
Vaccinated, so let's get it.
You people get your shots. Let's not have any of this shot denial, this vaccine denialism. It's ridiculous. It's childish. Grow up. Get your shots.
And if a guy like me can get shot, you know, everybody else can too.
Yeah.
So.
All right, everybody listen to John and Greg. Thank you for coming. Thank you to our wonderful audience and for everybody's questions. I'm sorry we got to almost all of them, but we are out of time for the evening. I hope everybody has a lovely Monday night. Hopefully this was a great way to start your week.
Cool.
And hopefully we'll see you again soon.
See you on the flip side, John.